The gunshot echoed across the valley like a promise of death, sending a flock of startled crows into the crimson-streaked sky as Lillian Greyson crouched behind her father's weathered barn. The year was 1874, and Dalhart, Texas, was still little more than a dusty settlement on the edge of civilization. But that hadn't stopped Conrad Blackwell from deciding he wanted every acre of the Greyson homestead for himself. Lillian's fingers trembled as she clutched the deed to her property, the last gift her father had given her before consumption had stolen him from this world just 3 months prior. At 22, she was now alone, responsible for the sprawling 300 acres of prime Texas rangeland that had been in her family since before the war. "Miss Greyson," a gruff voice called out, "Mr. Blackwell's offer still stands. $500 for the whole spread." "That's more than generous for a woman with no family to help work this land." Lillian's jaw clenched. $500 was a pittance compared to the true value, and everyone in 3 counties knew it. The Greyson land had the most reliable water source in the region, a spring-fed creek that never ran dry, even in the worst droughts. That water alone made her property worth 10 times Blackwell's insulting offer. "My answer hasn't changed, Mr. Decker." She shouted back, her voice stronger than she felt. "This land isn't for sale. Not to Mr. Blackwell, not to anyone." The man spat tobacco juice into the dust. "Then Mr. Blackwell says you best be prepared for hard times, Miss Greyson. Real hard times." The 3 men mounted their horses, but not before one fired another shot into the air, a parting reminder of their intentions. Lillian remained hidden until the thundering hoofbeats faded into the distance. Only then did she allow herself to breathe. As the adrenaline faded, weariness took its place. She'd been fighting this battle for weeks now, ever since Conrad Blackwell had first shown up at her door with his false smile and predatory eyes. The cattle baron owned most of the surrounding territory already, and her refusal to sell was the only obstacle to his complete domination of the region's water rights. Lillian straightened her simple cotton dress and wiped a smudge of dirt from her cheek. Though exhaustion pulled at her bones, there were still chores to finish before nightfall. The small herd of cattle wouldn't feed themselves, nor would the chickens or the 2 workhorses her father had depended upon. She was halfway to the chicken coop when she noticed a plume of dust on the horizon. Another rider, approaching fast. Lillian's heart sank. Had Blackwell's men returned so quickly? She hurried inside the cabin, retrieving her father's old Remington rifle from above the fireplace. She wasn't a crack shot, but she could hit what she aimed at if the distance wasn't too great. The rider drew closer, and Lillian positioned herself on the porch, rifle held firmly against her shoulder, pointed toward the approaching figure. The sun was at his back, making it impossible to discern his features clearly, but she could tell it was a single man on a chestnut stallion. "That's far enough," she called when he was within earshot. The stranger pulled his horse to a stop, raising both hands slowly to show he carried no weapon. "Madam, I don't mean any harm. Name's Kieran Cooper. I'm looking for work." Lillian didn't lower her rifle. "There's no work here." The man Kieran removed his hat, revealing a shock of sun-bleached brown hair and a face weathered by years in the elements. He wasn't much older than she was, perhaps 27 or 28, with clear blue eyes that studied her with frank assessment but no menace. "Begging your pardon, madam, but from what I can see, there's plenty of work here." His gaze swept across the property, taking in the loose fence boards, the overgrown pasture, and the partially collapsed corner of the barn roof. "And not enough hands to do it." A flush of embarrassment and indignation colored Lillian's cheeks. "I'm managing just fine." Kieran Cooper said nothing, but his raised eyebrow spoke volumes. Mr. Cooper, I appreciate your interest, but I can't afford to hire help right now. He shifted in his saddle. I'm not asking for much, Miss Greyson. Lillian Greyson. Miss Greyson. I need a place to stay and regular meals. I'll work from sunup to sundown for that and $1 a week. It was a ridiculously low offer, even for these parts, and they both knew it. Suspicion flickered through Lillian's mind. Did Conrad Blackwell send you? She asked bluntly. A flash of confusion crossed Kieran's features. Don't know any Blackwell. I just rode in from Fort Worth. Been working cattle drives, but I'm looking for something more settled. Lillian lowered the rifle slightly, studying him. His clothes were worn but clean, and though his face was unshaven, there was an honest quality to his gaze that made her hesitate to send him away. And heaven knew she needed the help if she had any hope of keeping the ranch afloat. I can offer you meals and the loft in the barn, Mr. Cooper. And 50 cents a week, that's all I can manage. Kieran Cooper smiled, and the expression transformed his face from merely handsome to something that made Lillian's breath catch unexpectedly in her throat. That'll do just fine, Miss Greyson. He extended his hand. Do we have a deal? After a moment's hesitation, Lillian stepped forward and clasped his calloused palm. For a trial period, 1 week. 1 week it is. His hand engulfed hers, warm and strong. I'll make it worth your while. She withdrew her hand quickly, suddenly aware of how improper it was to be alone with this stranger, making arrangements without a chaperone. But her father was gone, and there was no one else to help her make decisions now. The barn's that way, she said, gesturing. Get yourself settled. Supper's at sundown. Kieran nodded, replaced his hat, and led his horse toward the barn. Lillian watched him go, wondering if she just made a terrible mistake or found an unexpected ally in her fight against Conrad Blackwell. She couldn't know it then, but Kieran Cooper would prove to be both her salvation and the greatest challenge to the walls she'd built around her heart. That evening, Lillian prepared a simple meal of beans, cornbread, and the last of the salt pork. She'd set the table for two, something she hadn't done since her father passed, when a knock came at the door. Kieran stood on her porch, hat in hand, his hair still damp from washing up at the pump. He'd shaved, she noticed, and changed into a clean shirt. Something smells mighty good, Miss Greyson, he said as she invited him in. It's nothing fancy, she replied, suddenly self-conscious about the modest offering. Please, sit down. Kieran waited until she took her seat before settling into the chair across from her. He bowed his head briefly, a silent grace, before accepting the plate she passed him. I noticed your fence line is down in several places, he said between bites, and that barn roof won't last another heavy rain. I can start repairs tomorrow if you've got the materials. There's lumber in the shed. My father had plans to do the repairs himself before he... Lillian's voice trailed off. I'm sorry for your loss, Kieran said quietly. Was it recent? 3 months ago. Consumption. Kieran nodded solemnly. My mother went the same way when I was 15. It's a hard thing to watch. The simple acknowledgement of shared grief created an unexpected connection between them. Lillian found herself relaxing slightly as the meal progressed. If you don't mind my asking, Kieran ventured, what was happening when I rode up? Seemed like you were expecting trouble. Lillian hesitated, weighing how much to tell this stranger. Something in his steady gaze encouraged honesty. Conrad Blackwell is the largest landowner in the county, she explained. He controls most of the water rights already, but our creek is the most reliable source for miles. He wants my land, and he's not taking no for an answer. Kieran's expression darkened. Those men who rode out as I was coming in, they were his. Yes. Blackwell's foreman, Jim Decker, and 2 of his hands. Lillian pushed her beans around her plate. This was their 3rd visit this month. Each time they're a little less polite about their intentions. Has he tried to buy you out fairly? $500 for 300 acres of prime land with year-round water, Lillian scoffed. It's robbery, not business. And the law? Sheriff Mills owes his election to Blackwell's influence. He says it's just neighbor trouble and I should consider the offer. Lillian's fingers tightened around her fork. This land is all I have left of my family. I won't let Blackwell take it, no matter what tactics he uses. Kieran studied her with newfound respect. That's a brave stance, Miss Greyson. Not brave, she corrected. Necessary. After supper, Kieran insisted on helping with the dishes, despite Lillian's protests that it wasn't part of their arrangement. As they worked side by side in the small kitchen, she found herself stealing glances at his profile, the strong line of his jaw, the faint scar that cut through his left eyebrow, the way his mouth curved upward slightly, even in repose. I should warn you, she said as he dried the last plate, working for me might put you at odds with the most powerful man in the county. Blackwell doesn't like people who get in his way. Kieran's smile was surprisingly gentle. I've crossed paths with men like Blackwell before, Miss Greyson. They're all the same, they mistake money for character and power for right. He handed her the dried plate. Besides, I've never been one to walk away from a fight worth fighting. His words shouldn't have provided as much comfort as they did. After all, he was just one man, a drifter she'd hired on a whim. Yet somehow, as Lillian prepared for bed that night, the knowledge that Kieran Cooper was sleeping in her barn made the darkness seem less threatening than it had the night before. Morning arrived with a brilliant Texas sunrise that painted the eastern sky in strokes of gold and amber. Lillian was already at work in the chicken coop when Kieran appeared, carrying a bundle of tools from the shed. "Morning, Miss Greyson," he called. "Thought I'd start on that south fence line before the heat gets too brutal." "There's coffee on the stove," she replied, "and some leftover cornbread if you want breakfast." "Already ate, madam. Found some apples in the barn. Hope you don't mind." "Not at all. Those windfall apples would just go to waste otherwise." Kieran tipped his hat and headed toward the broken section of fence. Lillian watched him go, admiring the efficient way he moved, purposeful, without wasted motion. There was something reassuring about his presence, a solid dependability that had been missing since her father's death. The morning passed quickly as Lillian attended to her usual chores. Occasionally, she'd glance up to see Kieran working steadily, replacing rotted posts and straightening the wire that had sagged between them. By midday, he'd repaired nearly 50 yards of fence work that would have taken her days to complete. She brought him water around noon, impressed by how much he'd accomplished. "You've done this before," she observed. Kieran wiped sweat from his brow with his forearm. "Worked a few ranches in my time. Spent 2 years on a spread near Amarillo before the owner lost it to gambling debts." He accepted the dipper gratefully. "This is good land you've got. Rich soil, plenty of water. Your father chose well. He came here right after marrying my mother. Said he knew this valley would be home the moment he saw it." Lillian's gaze swept across the rolling landscape. "I was born in that house, Mr. Cooper. Every memory I have is rooted in this soil." Kieran returned the dipper. "Then we'll make sure it stays yours, Miss Greyson." The simple declaration, spoken with quiet certainty, sent an unexpected warmth through Lillian's chest. It had been so long since anyone had stood beside her, since she'd heard "we" instead of struggling alone. "Supper will be ready at sundown," she said, turning back toward the house to hide the sudden moisture in her eyes. "I'll be there," he promised. The sound of approaching horses came later that afternoon. Lillian was in the vegetable garden when she heard them, at least 4 riders coming fast. Her heart pounded as she dropped her basket and ran toward the house, but Kieran was already there, rifle in hand. "Get inside, Miss Greyson," he said calmly, his eyes never leaving the approaching riders. "Mr. Cooper, please, Lillian." It was the first time he'd used her given name, and something in his tone brooked no argument. "I'll handle this." She retreated to the porch, her father's Remington clutched in her hands, as 4 mounted men came into view. Jim Decker led them, his weathered face twisted in a permanent sneer. The 3 men with him were strangers to Lillian, rougher looking than Blackwell's usual hands, with the hard eyes of men who solved problems with violence. "Well, well," Decker called as they reined in. "Miss Greyson's got herself a watchdog." Kieran stood his ground, rifle held casually but ready. "Afternoon, gentlemen. Something I can help you with." Decker spat tobacco juice into the dust. "This ain't your concern, stranger. We've got business with the lady." "Miss Greyson isn't interested in whatever business you're offering," Kieran replied evenly, "and I'm making it my concern." One of the riders, a hulking man with a pockmarked face, laughed. "1 man against 4. Those are poor odds, friend." "Depends on the man," Kieran said with a faint smile that didn't reach his eyes. Something in his stance shifted subtly, and Lillian suddenly had the impression of a coiled spring, potential energy barely contained. Decker's eyes narrowed. "You got a name, Mr. Kieran Cooper?" A flicker of recognition crossed Decker's face, though he tried to hide it. "Never heard of you." "That's funny," Kieran replied, "because your eyes just told me otherwise." A tense silence stretched between them, broken only by the soft nickering of horses and the distant call of a hawk. Lillian held her breath, finger resting near the trigger of her rifle. Finally, Decker jerked his chin toward his men. "We'll be back, Cooper, and Mr. Blackwell will want to hear about Miss Greyson's new employee." "You tell Blackwell whatever you like," Kieran said. "But the next time you or any of his men set foot on this property uninvited, you won't be riding back to tell him anything." The quiet certainty in his voice sent a chill down Lillian's spine, and evidently affected Decker as well. The foreman's face flushed with anger, but he made no move to dismount. "This ain't over," he growled, wheeling his horse around. "Not by a long shot." The 4 men rode away, dust billowing in their wake. Only when they were well out of sight did Kieran lower his rifle and turn toward Lillian. "You all right?" he asked, mounting the porch steps. She nodded, though her hands were shaking slightly. "What did he recognize about your name?" Kieran's expression turned guarded. "I've worked as a range detective in the past, helped the Rangers track down some cattle rustlers a few years back." "Word gets around." It wasn't the whole truth, Lillian sensed, but she didn't press him. Whatever his past, Kieran Cooper had just placed himself squarely between her and Blackwell's threats, and for that she was grateful. "Thank you," she said simply. His eyes met hers, and something unspoken passed between them, an acknowledgement that the stakes had just been raised. "You should be prepared," he warned. "Blackwell won't take this lightly." "I know." Lillian squared her shoulders. "But neither will I." That evening, their conversation over supper was more subdued. Kieran told her about the repairs he'd completed and outlined his plans for the barn roof, carefully avoiding any mention of the confrontation with Decker. But the tension lingered in the air between them, along with something else, a growing awareness that made Lillian's cheeks warm whenever their eyes met. "How long have you been on your own, Mr. Cooper?" she asked as they finished their meal. Kieran considered the question. "In a way, most of my life. After my mother died, my father took to the bottle. He was there in body, but not much else." A shadow crossed his face. "I left home at 16, worked my way west with cattle drives, took whatever honest work I could find. No family waiting for you somewhere." The question slipped out before Lillian could stop herself. A faint smile touched his lips. "No, Miss Greyson, no family, no home to speak of, just me and Rusty, that's my horse." Surely there must have been someone. Lillian felt herself blushing. A woman, I mean. There was once. Kieran's eyes grew distant. Daughter of a rancher I worked for in Oklahoma Territory. Her father had other plans for her, though married her off to a banker from Tulsa. He shrugged. It was for the best. I didn't have much to offer back then. And now? The question hung in the air between them, laden with meaning neither was ready to acknowledge. Kieran's gaze met hers, startlingly direct. Now I know what matters, Miss Greyson. And it isn't money or land or power. It's finding something worth fighting for. The days that followed fell into a rhythm. Kieran worked from dawn until dusk, methodically addressing the ranch's most pressing needs. He repaired the barn roof, reinforced the corral, and continued restoring the fence line. Lillian found herself watching him when he wasn't looking, the play of muscles beneath his shirt. As he worked, the careful precision of his hands, the quiet competence with which he approached every task. For his part, Kieran seemed to sense when she needed help and when she needed to prove to herself more than to him that she could manage on her own. He never intruded on her independence, but somehow was always there when a job required more strength than she possessed. A week passed, then two. Blackwell's men didn't return, but Lillian knew it was only a matter of time. The land baron wasn't a man who accepted defeat, particularly not at the hands of a woman and a hired hand. "Mr. Cooper," she said one evening as they sat on the porch after supper, watching the sunset paint the western sky, "your trial period ended over a week ago." Kieran glanced at her, surprise evident in his expression. "Are you giving me notice, Miss Greyson?" No, that's not what I meant." Lillian smoothed her skirts nervously. "I just realized we never discussed how long you plan to stay." Relief flickered across his features. "I hadn't thought about it, to be honest. There's still plenty of work to be done here." "Yes, there is," she agreed. "And I've appreciated your help more than I can say." Something in her tone made Kieran turn to face her fully. But I can't help feeling that I'm keeping you here under false pretenses," Lillian admitted. "Blackwell isn't going to give up. The situation is likely to get worse before it gets better. You didn't sign on for a range war." Kieran was quiet for a long moment, his gaze returning to the horizon where the last light was fading from the sky. "Lillian," he said finally, using her given name again. "I knew what I was walking into the moment Decker and his men showed up that first day. I'm not staying out of obligation or because I've got nowhere else to go." "Then why?" His eyes found hers in the gathering dusk. "Because some things are worth standing for. This land, what it means to you," he paused. "And because I've never met anyone quite like you before." Lillian's heart beat faster. "What do you mean?" Most people would have sold to Blackwell by now, taken the money and started over somewhere else. His voice was soft but intense. "But not you. You've got grit, Lillian Greyson, the kind that can't be bought or bullied away." "My father used to say stubbornness ran in the family," she said with a small smile. "It's more than stubbornness. It's knowing what matters and being willing to fight for it." Kieran's hand moved across the space between them, coming to rest lightly over hers. "I admire that. More than I should, probably." The warmth of his touch sent a jolt through Lillian that had nothing to do with fear or caution. For a breathless moment, she imagined turning her hand to lace her fingers with his, leaning toward him in the fading light. The sound of a wagon approaching broke the spell. Kieran withdrew his hand and stood, peering into the gathering darkness. "Were you expecting visitors?" "No." Lillian rose as well, straining to see who might be calling at this hour. As the wagon drew closer, she recognized the slight figure driving it. "It's Martha Wilson from town. She runs the general store with her husband." Martha pulled her team to a halt before the house. She was a plump, motherly woman in her 50s, with kind eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. Tonight, however, her usually cheerful face was tight with worry. "Lillian, dear," she called, climbing down from the wagon seat. "I came as quick as I could." "What is it, Martha? What's wrong?" Martha cast a curious glance at Kieran before answering. "It's Blackwell. He was in the store this afternoon, talking to some rough characters I've never seen before. Hired guns, by the look of them." She lowered her voice. "I overheard enough to know he's planning something against you, soon." A cold knot formed in Lillian's stomach. "Did you hear what exactly?" "No, they moved outside when they got to specifics, but one of them said something about making it look like an accident." Martha's eyes filled with tears. "I'm scared for you, child. You know Thomas, and I think of you like a daughter. Why don't you come stay with us in town for a while?" "I can't leave the ranch, Martha. It would be abandoning everything my father worked for." "Your father wouldn't want you risking your life over property," Martha argued. "It's not just property," Lillian said firmly. "It's my home, my heritage, my future." Kieran, who had been listening silently, stepped forward. "Mrs. Wilson, I'm Kieran Cooper. I'm working for Miss Greyson." Martha assessed him with the shrewd gaze of a woman who had seen many men come and go in a frontier town. "Are you now? And what exactly does that entail, Mr. Cooper?" "Martha," Lillian exclaimed, embarrassed by the implication. Kieran wasn't offended. "It means Miss Greyson isn't alone here, madam, and I have some experience dealing with men like Blackwell and the kind he hires." "One man against Blackwell's money can't change much," Martha said skeptically. "Maybe not," Kieran conceded, "but one man can buy time. And time is what we need right now." "Time for what?" Lillian asked. "Time to gather evidence of Blackwell's tactics. Time to reach out to the right people who can put pressure on him legally." Kieran turned to Martha. "Mrs. Wilson, do you know anyone in town who stood up to Blackwell before?" Martha considered the question. "Judge Harmon, perhaps. He's retired now, but he was never in Blackwell's pocket. And there's Reverend Taylor. He preached against land grabbing just last Sunday, though he didn't name names." "Good. We need allies, not just in town but throughout the county. People who have been bullied by Blackwell but were too afraid to speak up alone." Kieran's mind was clearly working through possibilities. If enough voices join together, even the sheriff can't ignore them. "You're talking about organizing against the most powerful man in the county," Martha said doubtfully. "I'm talking about justice, Mrs. Wilson. And from what I've seen of this community, there are still people who believe in that." Martha's expression softened as she looked from Kieran to Lillian and back again. Something about what she saw seemed to reassure her. "Well, Mr. Cooper, perhaps you're exactly what this situation needed." She reached out to pat Lillian's hand. "I'll speak with the judge tomorrow. And I'll let Thomas know there's a good man looking out for our girl." After extracting a promise from Lillian to be careful, Martha departed. As they watched her wagon disappear down the road, Kieran turned to Lillian. "We should prepare," he said quietly. "If Blackwell's hiring guns, he's done with sending messages. What do you suggest?" "First, we secure the house and barn, board up the windows on the ground floor, reinforce the doors. Then we take inventory of ammunition and supplies in case we need to withstand a siege." The practicality of his words couldn't disguise their gravity. For the first time, Lillian fully comprehended the danger they faced, not just to her property but to their lives. "Kieran," she said softly, "this isn't your fight. You could leave, find work elsewhere without risking your life for a piece of land that isn't yours." In the silver moonlight, his expression was solemn yet determined. "That's where you're wrong, Lillian. Some fights choose you." His hand found hers again, and this time she didn't pull away. "And some people are worth fighting for." The night was filled with purpose as they worked to fortify the small ranch house. Kieran moved furniture to block the most vulnerable windows, while Lillian took stock of their food supplies. By the time exhaustion forced them to rest, the house was as secure as they could make it. "You should try to sleep," Kieran said, checking the load in his revolver one final time. "I'll keep watch for a while." Lillian knew she should go to her bedroom, maintain the propriety that their situation had already strained beyond convention. But the thought of being alone with her fears was unbearable. "I'll stay up with you," she said. "I wouldn't sleep anyway." They sat together in the darkened main room, a single lamp burning low on the table between them. Outside, the night was alive with the sounds of crickets and the occasional hoot of an owl. It seemed impossible that danger could exist in a world that continued so peacefully. "Tell me about your father," Kieran said softly, breaking the silence. "What kind of man was he?" The unexpected question opened a floodgate of memories. Lillian found herself describing her father's laugh, his unwavering sense of justice, the gentle way he had of explaining the world to a curious child. She told Kieran about learning to ride, about helping with the spring calves, about the books her father would read aloud during the long winter evenings. "He sounds like a remarkable man," Kieran said when she finally fell silent. "He was." Lillian's throat tightened. "He would have liked you, I think." "I hope so." Kieran's voice held a note of uncertainty she hadn't heard before. "Lillian, I need to tell you something about my past." She waited, sensing his struggle. "I wasn't entirely truthful about why Decker recognized my name," he admitted. "I did work with the Rangers, but there's more to it than that." Kieran's hands tightened around his rifle. "I used to ride with a man named Jackson Blackwell, Conrad's brother." Shock rippled through Lillian. "You worked for the Blackwells?" "Not exactly." "Jackson and I were both hired guns for the Sutton-Taylor feud down in DeWitt County. This was years ago, before I knew better." His voice was edged with regret. "We weren't friends, but we rode together for a time. I saw firsthand how the Blackwells operate, taking what they want, destroying anyone who stands in their way." "What happened?" Kieran's jaw tightened. "Jackson tried to force himself on a farmer's daughter after we'd been sent to intimidate her father into selling. I stopped him. Things got ugly." His eyes met hers, unflinching. "I shot him, Lillian. Not dead, but bad enough that he walks with a limp to this day. Conrad swore he'd see me hang for it. So when you rode in here, I had no idea this was Blackwell territory," he said quickly. "I've been careful to stay clear of anywhere the family has influence, but when you told me who was threatening you..." He sighed. "I should have left then, before Decker recognized me. Now I've made you an even bigger target." Lillian absorbed this revelation, searching her heart for any change in her feelings toward the man beside her. She found none, only a deeper understanding of the demons that had shaped him. "You stayed to protect me, knowing it might mean facing your own past," she said softly. "That took courage, Kieran." "Or foolishness," he replied with a humorless laugh. "Conrad Blackwell doesn't forget a grudge. When he finds out I'm here, he'll come with everything he has." "Then we'll face him together," Lillian said, surprising herself with her certainty. "My father always said true character shows itself not in how we avoid our troubles, but in how we confront them." Kieran studied her face in the lamplight, wonder and something deeper reflected in his eyes. "You are the most remarkable woman I've ever known, Lillian Greyson." Before she could respond, a sound from outside caught their attention, the distant rumble of approaching horses. Many horses. Kieran was on his feet instantly, moving to the window to peer through a small gap in the boards. "At least 6 riders," he reported grimly. "Coming fast." Lillian's heart pounded as she reached for her rifle. Blackwell's men, most likely. Kieran checked his weapons one last time. "Stay away from the windows, no matter what happens. If they start shooting, get down behind the stove. It's the most solid cover in here." "I'm not hiding while you face them alone," she protested. The look he gave her was both exasperated and admiring. "I'm not asking you to hide, Lillian. I'm asking you to survive." His voice softened. "Because I've just found someone worth living for, and I'd like the chance to tell you properly when this is over." The implications of his words stole her breath. Before she could respond, the riders thundered into the yard surrounding the house. "Cooper," a voice bellowed from outside. "We know you're in there. Come out now and the woman doesn't have to get hurt." Kieran's expression hardened. "That's Blackwell himself," he murmured. "I recognize the voice." "What do we do?" Lillian whispered. Kieran thought for a moment. "We talk," he decided. "Buy time. Martha said she was going to speak with the judge tomorrow. If we can hold them off until word spreads in town that something's happening here." He moved to the door, positioning himself to one side. "Blackwell," he called through the thick wood, "this is private property. Miss Greyson has asked you repeatedly to stay away." "This is between you and me now, Cooper," Blackwell shouted back. "You think I wouldn't find out you were hiding here? The man who crippled my brother." "Your brother was attempting to rape an innocent girl," Kieran responded, his voice carrying clearly through the night air. "I stopped him. Any decent man would have done the same." A shot rang out, the bullet splintering wood near the doorframe. Lillian flinched but held her ground. "I've got 10 men out here, Cooper," Blackwell warned. "We can burn you out if we have to." "And hang for murder," Kieran challenged. "Is that what you want, Conrad, to add that to your reputation? The whole county knows you're after Miss Greyson's land. If anything happens to her, everyone will know who's responsible." There was a moment of silence as Blackwell considered this logic. "Send the woman out," he countered. "My quarrel's not with her. She can walk away from this, take my offer for the land, and go start fresh somewhere else." Kieran looked to Lillian, who shook her head firmly. "Miss Greyson declines your generous offer," Kieran called, a hint of sarcasm coloring his tone. "She's rather attached to her home." "Then you're both fools." Another shot followed, this one punching through one of the boarded windows. Kieran pulled Lillian down to the floor beside him as more gunfire erupted, bullets thudding into the cabin's walls. "They're trying to scare us," he said close to her ear. "If they wanted us dead, they'd rush the house." "What do they want then? To wear us down? Make us desperate enough to accept Blackwell's terms?" Kieran's eyes were grim in the dim light. "We need to show them we won't be intimidated." He crawled to another window, carefully positioning his rifle through a narrow gap. Taking aim at the ground near one of the horses, he fired. The animal reared in panic, nearly unseating its rider. "That's your only warning, Blackwell," Kieran shouted. "The next shot won't miss. You're outnumbered, Cooper." Blackwell's voice had lost some of its confidence. "Maybe so, but how many men are you willing to lose tonight?" "Because I promise you this, if you come through that door, I'll take at least 4 of you with me." The authority in Kieran's voice gave even Lillian chills. It was the voice of a man who had faced death before and wasn't bluffing now. A tense silence fell over the yard. Lillian could imagine Blackwell conferring with his men, weighing his options. Finally, his voice came again, less certain than before. "This isn't over, Cooper, not by a long shot." "It could be," Kieran replied. "Ride away now, Blackwell. Leave Miss Greyson in peace. There's plenty of land in Texas without stealing from a woman who's only protecting what's rightfully hers." "You always were self-righteous, Cooper." Blackwell's tone was bitter. "Even back when you rode with Jackson, acting like you're better than the rest of us." "Not better," Kieran said quietly. "Just trying to do right, something you might consider for a change." Another long silence followed, then the sound of horses moving, hooves receding into the distance. Kieran remained vigilant, watching from the window until he was certain all the riders had departed. Only then did he turn to Lillian, his face lined with tension and exhaustion. "They're gone. For now." Lillian sagged against the wall, the adrenaline draining from her body. "Will they be back?" "Yes," Kieran said honestly. "But not tonight, I think. Blackwell needs to regroup, come up with a new strategy." He sat beside her on the floor, his shoulder touching hers. "We bought ourselves some time." "Time for what?" Lillian's voice wavered slightly. "They'll just come back with more men. Or wait until you have to leave the house for supplies or to tend the animals." Kieran's hand found hers in the darkness, his fingers warm and solid against her trembling ones. "Time for the law to work if we're lucky. Time for Martha to rally support in town." He squeezed her hand gently. "And time for you to decide what you really want, Lillian." She turned to face him, confused. "What do you mean?" "I mean that land is important. I understand that better than most. But at some point, you have to ask yourself what you're fighting for. Is it the deed to this property, or what this place represents to you?" His voice softened. "Because if it's a home, you're defending a place to belong, to build a life that might be something we could find elsewhere if it came to that." The implication of his words, the "we" that encompassed both of them, made Lillian's heart skip. "Are you suggesting I give up after all?" "Never," he said firmly. "I'm suggesting we consider all our options, including ones where we face the future together, whatever that might mean." Before Lillian could respond, exhaustion overcame her. The emotional and physical strain of the night caught up with her suddenly, and she found herself leaning into Kieran's solid warmth, her eyes heavy. "Rest," he murmured, shifting to make her more comfortable against his shoulder. "I'll keep watch." As she drifted towards sleep, cradled in the protective circle of his arm, Lillian realized something profound. For the first time since her father's death, she didn't feel alone. Whatever challenges tomorrow brought, she would face them with Kieran Cooper at her side. And somehow, that made all the difference. Morning light filtered through the boarded windows, rousing Lillian from her uncomfortable position on the floor. She became aware of two things simultaneously. Her entire body ached from sleeping sitting up, and Kieran was no longer beside her. Panic fluttered in her chest until she heard movement in the kitchen. Following the sound, she found Kieran at the stove, preparing coffee. The domestic scene was so at odds with the danger they'd faced that it momentarily disoriented her. "You're awake," he said, turning to offer her a steaming cup. "How did you sleep?" "Better than I had any right to," she admitted, accepting the coffee gratefully. "Thank you for keeping watch." Kieran nodded toward the window. "We have company coming. Looks friendly, though." Lillian moved to see what he was referring to. A procession of wagons and riders was approaching from the direction of Dalhart, at least a dozen vehicles, maybe more. What on earth? "I think word has spread faster than we anticipated," Kieran said, a note of surprise in his voice. They stepped onto the porch together as the first wagon pulled into the yard. Martha Wilson was driving, with Judge Harmon, a dignified man in his 70s, seated beside her. Behind them came what seemed like half the town: shopkeepers, farmers, ranchers from neighboring properties, even Reverend Taylor with his Bible prominently displayed on the seat beside him. "Lillian," Martha called, her round face beaming with triumph. "We've brought reinforcements." Judge Harmon descended from the wagon with the careful movements of age, but his voice was strong as he addressed them. "Miss Greyson, Mr. Cooper, we understand you had visitors last night of the unwelcome variety." "Word travels fast," Kieran observed, his hand instinctively moving to rest at the small of Lillian's back. "Faster than Blackwell anticipated, I'd wager," the judge said with a grim smile. "You see, Conrad's mistake was thinking everyone in this county is as afraid of him as the sheriff." but there are plenty of us who remember when Dalhart was a community that stood together against threats. Martha bustled forward. When I told the judge what I'd overheard, he started reaching out to others who have had run-ins with Blackwell over the years. Turns out, there's quite a few people with stories to tell. Stories that amount to a pattern of intimidation, theft, and abuse of power, Judge Harmon added. Enough that even Sheriff Mills can't ignore it, especially with witnesses willing to testify. Lillian was overwhelmed by this unexpected show of support. I don't know what to say. All of you came out here for us. For you, Martha corrected gently, and for ourselves. Blackwell's been squeezing this community dry for years. It was time someone took a stand. Reverend Taylor stepped forward. Miss Greyson, your father was a respected member of our community, a man of principle. We failed him by not speaking up sooner about Blackwell's tactics. We won't fail his daughter the same way. Tears welled in Lillian's eyes as she looked at the gathering of neighbors and townspeople, some she knew well, others only by sight. But all had come to stand with her against a common threat. What happens now? Kieran asked, his voice steady despite the emotion Lillian could feel running through him. Now, Judge Harmon said, we pay a visit to Sheriff Mills. With this many witnesses prepared to file formal complaints, he'll have no choice but to act against Blackwell or risk losing his badge when the circuit judge comes through next month. And in the meantime, Martha added, you two won't be alone. We've organized a rotation of folks to stay out here until this matter is settled. Blackwell might risk threatening a lone woman and a single hired hand, but he won't dare move against half the county. The realization that they were truly no longer alone in this fight washed over Lillian like a cleansing rain. She felt Kieran's hand tighten slightly at her waist, an unspoken acknowledgement of what this meant for them both. Thank you, she said simply, her voice thick with emotion. All of you. My father would be proud to see the community come together like this. As the gathering dispersed to set up an impromptu camp on her property, Lillian found herself standing with Kieran at the edge of the porch, slightly removed from the bustle of activity. Did you know this would happen? She asked, watching as men unloaded supplies and women set up cooking stations. Not exactly, he admitted. I hoped Martha might find us a few allies, but this. He gestured to the scene before them. This is something special, Lillian. It's what community should be. She studied his profile, seeing the wonder in his expression, the look of a man who had drifted for years without roots, suddenly witnessing what it meant to truly belong somewhere. Kieran, she said softly, last night before Blackwell arrived, you said something. About finding something worth living for. A flush of color touched his cheekbones. I did. Did you mean it? His eyes met hers, unguarded and honest, every word. From the moment I rode onto your land, Lillian, something changed in me. I've spent my life drifting from place to place, never staying long enough to form attachments, but with you. His voice dropped lower. With you, I found myself imagining a future, putting down roots, building something that lasts. Lillian's heart hammered in her chest. Even with all this trouble, the danger, especially because of it, he said. Seeing you stand your ground against Blackwell, refusing to be intimidated, it showed me what real courage looks like. And it made me realize that some things, some people are worth fighting for, worth staying for. And if this ends well, she asked, hardly daring to hope. If Blackwell is stopped and the threat is gone, Kieran reached for her hand, his calloused palm warm against her skin. Then I'd like your permission to stay anyway, not as a hired hand, but as. He hesitated, searching for the right words, as a partner, in whatever way you'd have me. The directness of his proposal, so characteristic of the man himself, brought a smile to Lillian's lips. I think, she said carefully, that this land could use a partner who knows its value, who's willing to work for its future. Her fingers tightened around his. And I think I could use one too. The joy that transformed Kieran's face was like sunrise breaking over the plains, sudden, brilliant, and full of promise. In full view of the townsfolk and with complete disregard for propriety, he drew her into his arms. "Lillian Greyson," he murmured, his forehead resting against hers, "I believe you've just made me the happiest man in Texas." Her laugh was soft and intimate. "We still have Blackwell to deal with, Mr. Cooper." "So we do," he agreed, his eyes never leaving hers. "But now we face him together, and that makes all the difference in the world." The confrontation with Conrad Blackwell came sooner than expected. By mid-afternoon, a cloud of dust on the horizon announced his approach, but unlike the previous night, he came with only 4 men. And unlike before, Blackwell found not an isolated woman and a lone defender, but a property bustling with determined citizens. Judge Harmon, Reverend Taylor, and several of the more prominent ranchers positioned themselves at the front of the gathering. Kieran and Lillian stood with them, presenting a united front as Blackwell and his men reined in their horses. The land baron's face darkened with fury as he surveyed the scene. "What is the meaning of this?" he demanded, his gaze fixing on the judge. "Community justice, Conrad," Judge Harmon replied evenly. "Something you seem to have forgotten exists." "This is a private matter between myself and Miss Greyson," Blackwell insisted. "Not anymore," the judge countered. "Not when you bring armed men to threaten a woman on her legal property. Not when you've spent years bullying your neighbors into selling land for a fraction of its worth." Blackwell's eyes narrowed. "You're making serious accusations, Harmon." "Accusations backed by 24 sworn statements," the judge replied, patting a leather portfolio tucked under his arm, "all documenting your tactics over the years. Statements we'll be presenting to Sheriff Mills this evening and to the circuit judge when he arrives next week, if necessary." For perhaps the first time in his life, Conrad Blackwell appeared genuinely uncertain. His gaze swept across the assembled crowd, recognizing faces of people he had intimidated or cheated in the past, now standing firm in defiance. "You think this changes anything?" he blustered, but the confidence was gone from his voice. "I own half this county. The banks listen to me." "One setback won't. It's over, Blackwell," Kieran interrupted, stepping forward. "You've lost this fight. The question is whether you're smart enough to retreat with your reputation merely damaged, or foolish enough to push until it's destroyed completely." A tense silence fell as the 2 men locked eyes across the yard. Something passed between them, a recognition, perhaps, that they were cut from different cloth, but understood the same language of power and consequence. Finally, Blackwell's shoulders sagged almost imperceptibly. "This isn't finished," he growled, but the threat sounded hollow even to his own ears. "Yes, it is," Judge Harmon said firmly. "Miss Greyson's property is hers to keep or sell as she chooses. Any further attempts to coerce her will be met with the full force of the law. Is that clear?" Blackwell's jaw worked as he struggled with his defeat. With a curt nod that acknowledged reality without conceding grace, he yanked his horse around. "Come on, boys," he muttered to his men. "We're done here." As they rode away, a cheer went up from the gathered townspeople. Hands reached out to pat Kieran's shoulder or squeeze Lillian's arm in congratulation. The triumph was communal, a victory not just for one woman's right to her land, but for the entire community's stand against tyranny. Martha Wilson appeared at Lillian's side, her eyes shining. "Your father would be so proud, dear," she said, embracing Lillian warmly. "So very proud." "I couldn't have done it without everyone's help," Lillian replied, her gaze finding Kieran in the crowd. especially his. Martha followed her gaze, a knowing smile spreading across her face. Yes, well. Some things are just meant to be, aren't they? She patted Lillian's hand. Now, I believe there's to be a celebration dinner. Several of us brought food to share. A proper community gathering, the first of many, I hope. As the afternoon mellowed into evening, the yard of the Greyson ranch transformed. Tables were set up beneath the old oak trees, loaded with food contributed from a dozen kitchens. Lanterns hung from branches, casting a golden glow over the gathering as the sun set behind the distant hills. Lillian found herself constantly surrounded by well-wishers, sharing stories of her father, offering advice on cattle breeding or crop rotation, extending invitations to social events in town that she had been too isolated to attend in recent months. The community she had always known existed, but had somehow lost touch with after her father's death, was embracing her once more. Through it all, Kieran remained close by, a steady presence at her side. Though he spoke little to the gathered townspeople, his quiet attentiveness to Lillian was noted by everyone present, as was the way her eyes sought his across the table, the subtle brush of his hand against hers when passing a plate, the private smiles they exchanged when they thought no one was watching. As the evening progressed and some of the visitors began to depart for home, Reverend Taylor approached them. The elderly clergyman's eyes twinkled with gentle understanding as he looked from Lillian to Kieran and back again. "Miss Greyson, Mr. Cooper," he greeted them. "A momentous day indeed." "Thanks to you and everyone else who stood with us," Lillian acknowledged. "Community is a powerful force," the Reverend agreed, "particularly when strengthened by other bonds." His gaze moved meaningfully between them. "I couldn't help but notice a certain understanding that seems to have developed between you two." Lillian felt heat rise to her cheeks, but Kieran's hand found hers openly now, his grip firm and sure. "Yes, sir," Kieran said simply. "There has." The Reverend nodded, unsurprised. "Well then, I conduct services every Sunday at 10, but I'm available other days as well, should you decide to formalize that understanding." With a benevolent smile, he moved on to bid farewell to other departing guests. "Formalize," Lillian repeated once they were alone, a mixture of amusement and wonder in her voice. "He certainly doesn't waste time." "Neither should we," Kieran replied, turning to face her fully. In the lantern light, his expression was solemn yet radiant with hope. "Lillian, I know we've known each other barely a month. I know there are 100 reasons why this is too soon, too sudden, too unconventional. But," she prompted, her heart thundering in her chest, "but I've spent my life wandering, never finding a place that felt like home until I rode onto your land." His hands cradled hers as if they were precious beyond measure. "I don't need more time to know what I want. I just need to know if you want the same." Lillian looked up at the man who had appeared in her life like an answer to a prayer. She hadn't known. She was making this man who had stood between her and danger, who had seen her strength rather than her vulnerability, who looked at her now as if she were the sunrise after the longest night. "I do," she whispered. "I want a partnership, a future, a home that we build together." The joy that blazed in Kieran's eyes outshone the lanterns around them. With gentle reverence, he leaned down to brush his lips against hers, their first kiss, witnessed only by the stars emerging in the darkening sky and the ancient oaks that had sheltered generations of Greysons before them. "Then I believe," he said softly as they parted, "we should take the good Reverend up on his offer. Soon." "How soon?" Lillian asked, breathless from the kiss and the enormity of what they were agreeing to. Kieran's smile held all the certainty she needed. "As soon as a proper courtship allows." "I want to do right by you, Lillian. No shortcuts, no compromises," she laughed, a sound of pure happiness. A proper courtship might be difficult, considering you already live in my barn. True enough, he conceded with a chuckle. Perhaps we can modify tradition slightly. They stood together as the last of the visitors departed, waving goodbye to Martha and Judge Harmon, thanking everyone for their support. When the final wagon had disappeared down the road, they found themselves truly alone for the first time since the previous night's confrontation. The ranch lay peaceful around them, bathed in moonlight. From this vantage point on the porch, Lillian could see the fields where her father had taught her to ride, the creek where she had learned to swim, the distant ridge where wildflowers blanketed the hillside each spring. All of it still hers, still theirs to cherish and nurture. "What happens now?" she asked, leaning into Kieran's embrace as they gazed out over the land they had defended together. "Now," he said, his voice warm with promise, "we build something lasting. Something worthy of the fight it took to protect it." His arms tightened around her. Together. Epilogue: 2 years later, the Greyson Cooper Ranch bustled with activity as neighbors and friends gathered to celebrate the harvest festival. Tables groaned under the weight of autumn bounty cornbread and pies, stews and roasted meats, preserves and fresh churned butter. Children darted between the legs of adults, their laughter ringing out across the yard where jack-o'-lanterns and cornstalks decorated the fence posts. From the porch of the expanded ranch house, Lillian watched the scene with contentment, one hand resting on her swollen belly. Their first child was due before Christmas, turning their joy into something even more profound. Kieran appeared at her side, carrying a plate of Martha Wilson's famous apple cobbler. "You should be sitting down," he chided gently, guiding her to the porch swing he had built for her last spring. "I'm perfectly fine," she assured him, though she accepted both the seat and the dessert gratefully. "Just enjoying the view." And what a view it was! In the 2 years since their wedding, the Greyson Cooper Ranch had flourished. With Kieran's expertise and determination complementing Lillian's deep knowledge of the land, they had expanded the cattle operation and added several improvements to the property. The barn had been completely rebuilt, larger and sturdier than before. A new bunkhouse accommodated the 2 hands they'd hired to help with the increased workload. The creek that had made their land so valuable now fed an irrigation system that had increased their crop yield substantially. But the physical improvements paled beside the transformation of the community itself. Blackwell's influence had waned significantly after his confrontation with the united townspeople. When several of his questionable business practices came to light during subsequent investigations, many of his financial backers had withdrawn their support. Though still wealthy, he was no longer the unchallenged power in the county. In his place had risen a more democratic approach to local governance, with Judge Harmon coming out of retirement to serve on the town council, and Reverend Taylor leading efforts to establish the region's first proper school. Lillian herself had become an advocate for small ranchers' rights, working with neighboring communities to ensure fair access to water and grazing lands. "Penny for your thoughts," Kieran said, his hand covering hers on her belly. Lillian smiled up at the man who had transformed from hired hand to husband, from defender to partner in all things. The past 2 years had only deepened her love for him, his integrity, his gentle strength, his unwavering dedication to their shared vision. "I was thinking about how much has changed," she replied. "How close we came to losing all this, and how grateful I am that you rode into my life when you did." Kieran's eyes, as blue and clear as the Texas sky, held hers with the same devotion that had sustained them through every challenge they had faced together. "I was lost until I found you, Lillian. You gave me a home when I didn't even know I was searching for one." "We gave each other a home," she corrected softly, leaning into his embrace as their child stirred beneath their joined hands. "And now we're building a legacy for the next generation." As the autumn sun began to set over the land they had fought for and won, Lillian and Kieran remained on the porch, surrounded by the community that had become their extended family, secure in the knowledge that what they had created together, love, home, purpose, was stronger than any threat, more valuable than any fortune, and as enduring as the Texas soil beneath their feet. In the end, Conrad Blackwell had wanted her property, but Kieran Cooper had ensured that neither Blackwell nor his men would ever take what truly mattered: the right to determine her own destiny, the freedom to choose her own path, and the joy of sharing that journey with the man who had risked everything to stand beside her. It was, Lillian reflected as she felt her husband's heartbeat against her cheek, the greatest victory of all.